Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's very exciting keynote event entitled Women, Peace and Security, a conversation with Canada's first Ambassador of Women, Peace and Security, Her Excellency Jacqueline O'Neill. Before I introduce our distinguished guest speaker, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. The Balsillie School of International Affairs is situated on the Haldimand Track, the land promised to the Six Nations, and the land which is the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. We're very proud to be situated on this land and to acknowledge it in all that we do, particularly these important keynote events. Jacqueline O'Neill is Canada's first Ambassador for Women, Peace and Security. Appointed by the Prime Minister in 2019, her primary role is to advise Ministers of Foreign Affairs, Defence, and numerous other departments engaged in implementing Canada's National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. Previously, Ambassador O'Neill was president of the Institute for Inclusive Security, a US-based organization that increased the inclusion of women in peace negotiations and related processes, including the reform of the police and military organizations. Over 13 years at Inclusive Security, she supported the creation of national strategies and policy frameworks for more than 30 countries, NATO, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the United Nations. She also worked directly with coalitions of women leaders in Colombia, South Sudan, Sudan, Pakistan, and beyond. Prior to that, Ambassador O'Neill worked at the United Nations Peacekeeping Mission in Sudan and at Khartoum's Ahfad University for Women. Along with former Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire, she helped found the Romeo Dallaire Child Soldiers Initiative to eliminate the use of children during conflict. She was also a policy advisor to Canada's Secretary of State for the Asia-Pacific region. Most recently, Ambassador O'Neill was a global fellow at Woodrow Wilson Center's Canada Institute, an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, and a member of the board of directors of the Canadian International Council. She has a bachelor's degree in commerce from the University of Alberta and a master's in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Ambassador O'Neill, we are delighted to host you today for this distinguished keynote event. The floor is yours. Welcome to the Balsillie School.
Thank you so much, Anne, and hello, everybody. I want to thank you, Anne, and your whole wonderful team. I'm always reading the work of your scholars and following your events online, so it's such a pleasure to be on this side of it. Before we start, I want to note, je vais parler pour la plupart en anglais, mais si vous voulez poser des questions, faire des commentaires en français, faites-les en français ou en anglais. Je peux les traduire de français à anglais. So if anyone wants to pose questions or make interventions in French, please feel free to do so. And I'll say, many months ago, near the start of the pandemic, I did a webinar that my mother joined. And she gave me some pretty clear feedback, which was that half an hour of me talking is not desirable. So she said, maybe you could have someone to interview you or mix it up a little bit for the audience. So I'm very happy, Anne, that we can structure this as more of a conversation, and you'll all be spared some straight monologuing from me on this point. So maybe I can head back to you, Anne, and you can take this conversation wherever you want it to go.
Thanks very much, Ambassador O'Neill. I would be very happy to start with a general question about your role. We'd love to know how one becomes Canada's first ambassador of Women, Peace and Security. In other words, please tell us about yourself and your journey through this role to date.
Sure, thank you. Well, I'm happy to share my path towards getting this job, but I feel I have to note that I have always been very bad at career planning. And I say this so that if there are students out there who perhaps feel like that and feel like me a little bit, don't worry, you can still things can work out even if you don't have a clear vision of where you always want to go. So really briefly, as you mentioned, Anna, I grew up just outside of Edmonton, Alberta. I went to the University of Alberta. I got a Bachelor of Commerce because it seemed like it would be a useful thing to get, to know how to read a balance sheet and all of that good stuff. And I worked in consulting for a little bit, and I hated it. I felt no connection to the work at all. I did a semester of undergrad in Chile, and then through a fluke, I ended up being able to come to Ottawa and work as a junior minister, or as political staff for a junior minister at the Department of Foreign Affairs. And while I was there, I found out that there's this thing called a Master's in Public Policy. I went to the States to go do it. And while I was there, I had two really transformational experiences. One was that General Romeo Dallaire was a fellow at the school where I was doing the Master's. And he was just starting his research around child soldiers. And he had asked, you know, when I found out that he was there, I basically showed up at his office and said, I'll do, you know, do you want me to transcribe the phone book for you? Can I pick up your dry cleaning? Anything to help you do your important work? And he said, I want to do some work on, from a military perspective, why are child soldiers useful? So instead of only making rights arguments, how can we think about the utility to armed forces of having child soldiers, and can we approach it in that perspective? So that was really formative for me in thinking, first of all, working with armed forces and military institutions and thinking from a range of perspectives. I also had a foundational experience during that time of being able to work at the UN peacekeeping mission in Sudan. And so I worked 3 days a week at an all-women's university and 3 days a week at the UN peacekeeping mission. And I found, this was right after the peace agreement had been signed, primarily between North and South. And I found that it was very early in the mission setup, but they were kind of like ships passing in the night. So the women at the All Women's University were holding workshops on constitutional reform, all kinds of things they needed to learn following a peace agreement, or, you know, implement following a peace agreement. The UN mission was doing the same, and there was no connection between them, despite there being really strong interest in doing so. So I ended up spending about 13 years in Washington, DC, trying to work on it being in that space and make that space smaller. And I would watch people in the US, colleagues and friends in the US, kind of go in and out of government. As you know, the US system is quite different. They have quite a wide range of political appointees, a lot of think tanks, people flow in and out of them. It's very different than our system here. And to be honest, I had no even real thought that there'd be a possibility that I could kind of go into government, having been outside forever. But at the same time, the civil society in Canada, and you'll hear a bit more about them later, including the Women, Peace and Security Network of Canada, a number of civil society groups have been advocating really strongly to the government to strengthen the implementation of our work on women, peace, and security as a government. So we currently have a national action plan. It's our second one. The first one was in 2011, and it was really driven by civil society. And the plan itself does not call for an ambassador, but a number in civil society and some key parliamentarians thought it would be useful to have someone with a mandate that spans various departments to have someone at this level and who would be an advocate. So Minister Freeland at the time announced that they'd be appointing someone. I ended up getting appointed in the summer of 2019, and here we are now. So my primary task through the mandate that I have is to provide confidential assessments and advice to the ministers who are engaged in our National Action Plan and continue to demonstrate leadership. So just quick snapshot, we have 8 departments plus the RCMP who are partners in this. So it's led by Global Affairs Canada, National Defense, and the RCMP. And then really importantly, there are 6 other departments as well: Justice, Immigration, Refugees, Women and Gender Equality, Public Safety, and I think crucially, Indigenous Services Canada and Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs. So my job relates to all of those, although I sit within Global Affairs, and it's just the absolute best job in the world.
Wow, wide and fascinating portfolio. Can we focus on the concept of women, peace, and security? In your own words, what is this concept, and what does it mean on a day-to-day basis?
I'm glad you asked, because it can be a pretty jargon-heavy space, and it really is an ultimately fairly basic concept. So I'll just say that the entire policy framework on it, and I'll talk about what it is, but it came up as a policy framework from women around the world. So women around the world came to Beijing about 25 years ago for the World Congress on Women. And there were a lot of women from different countries in all parts of the world dealing with war. And despite coming from very different places, very different cultures, they found that they had very similar experiences. So during the war, they kept essential services in communities. Some of them fought as combatants. Many of them called for an end to the war. Some of them mediated. Some of them tried to get parties to go to the negotiating table. And yet, when it came time for formal negotiating processes, they were almost exclusively shut out. And they just decided, you know, this is wrong and this is unacceptable. So they advocated for about 5 years to get the highest security-focused body in the world, the UN Security Council, to pass a resolution saying that women are not only victims of conflict, but they have to be involved as decision makers. And we have to be intentional about that happening. And so they got a resolution passed in the year 2000. It's called Resolution 1325. It's the last time Canada was on the Security Council. We supported it. It was led by Namibia, by Bangladesh and Jamaica. And that was the birth of the term kind of women, peace, and security. And it's based on the idea that everybody should have the opportunity to have a voice in decisions that affect their lives. And that the results of those decisions are more just and they're more enduring when the people most directly affected by them are involved. So that's the essence of it. It's just everybody deserves an option to be engaged, and that women in particular are among those who are most systematically excluded. And that was 20 years ago that this became a sort of term of art. And we have quite a lot of evidence now that it makes a difference. And it's not just, so to speak, to women, but to whole communities. So, for example, there's evidence now that peace agreements are 35% more likely to last at least 5 years, or 15 years, excuse me, when women play a meaningful role in their creation. And there are a whole bunch of reasons for that. It's not about saying that women are inherently more peaceful or women are more likely to do certain things. It's saying that the diversity of perspectives matter. And when you get them around the table, they will address a broader set of issues. And there's a quick story, if I can, to just illustrate one example that I like to share with people about the real specificity of this. And that was that several years ago, so around 2009, there were peace negotiations in Darfur between the government of Sudan and various Darfuri rebel groups. And there were very, very, very few women on the government side, none in the rebel group side. And Canada had Senator Mobina Jaffer was one of our special envoys to Sudan. And she said, okay, well, these various rebel leaders, most of whom are living in exile, the UN is paying to bring them from Paris, from other parts of Europe, to fly to Abuja, where the talks were, and engage in negotiations. And she said, can we not also pay to have a range of women here to just, be part of these negotiations? This does not seem right. So after a lot of negotiations, they agreed that at least the women could be there. They could be, I think, what they were called technical advisors. So they could not be around the table. They were basically in a room outside of where the core negotiations were taking place. And as language was negotiated, they kind of run it by the women, and they felt relatively unsatisfied with the process, but at least they were there. I think there were about 15 of them from different parts of Darfur. And there was one moment where the negotiators came out, the conversation had stalled, negotiations were stuck, and they came out and everybody's getting coffee, and the women said, like, what's up, what's going on? And they said, well, we cannot agree who gets control over this certain river. And they said, oh, and so the women kind of walked into the room. They saw a big map on the wall. And they said, that river. And they said, yep, we just, we can't agree. Things are stalled. Not sure how we're going to proceed. We're at a real impasse. And several of the women looked at the map and they kind of said, this river. And I said, yep, that river. And one of them said, that river dried up 3 years ago. That river is no longer a river. And so I like to share that story because it's an example of women not talking about what are, incorrectly labeled so-called women's issues. It's in part that women in Darfur bear primary responsibility for water collection. It's that they've been living in their communities and they know this in and out. And you just need voices from communities most affected around the table. So, there's similar experiences from Northern Ireland, from Guatemala, from Colombia, from everywhere else. And, I think part of when we talk about women, peace, and security, it's about saying that every single aspect that we think about as it relates to security has a dimension where we need to think about the role of women. And, your question was on a day-to-day basis. So part of what I do at Global Affairs in particular is help people see those dimensions that they relate to security, because it's not always obvious, right? And I'll share just really quickly, we had some conversations recently around various forms, various weapons systems, and talking about chemical weapons. So what's the gender dimension of chemical weapons? How does it affect women? Gender and women, of course, not the same, but focusing on women, what are those dimensions? And turns out there's quite a few. So what does it mean on a day-to-day basis? It means thinking about things like the fact that some toxic agents can result in reproductive problems like miscarriages and infertility. They're very rarely noted, let alone tracked over time. You're thinking about responding to a chemical weapons incident. There are very few female first responders. So in situations where it's crucial to get help immediately, often to remove clothing, which is the primary and first thing that they'll do, women are disadvantaged. In many places, women are largely responsible for cleaning up after weapons attacks. And so if they're not informed about protocols, about dangers, about all kinds of things, they're going to be at more risk. Women often handle dead bodies. This was the case in the Ebola crisis. And so there's all kinds of dimensions where you need to be engaging and talking to women in local communities who are talking about how to prevent chemical weapons attacks, about the cost of them, and about educating communities on what to do if there is one. And that's just an example to share that there's a dimension of this in almost everything that we do, and it can be related to day-to-day work in a way that's not just convening peace talks.
Thank you. And I'd like to extend on that and ask you about some of the common misperceptions about the women, peace, and security agenda too. Perhaps the common misperceptions that hinder the implementation of the agenda.
Sure. There are many, I think. As I mentioned, it's an issue that has a lot of jargon sometimes, or I think sometimes people tune out a little bit thinking it doesn't relate to them. But one of the biggest challenges in terms of people's understanding of it is that there still is a perception among many that this is an agenda that's driven by Western feminists, white feminists in particular, and it's just simply not culturally appropriate in whatever place you want to insert. So let's just break that down for a second. The idea that it's a Western agenda is just simply incorrect, and so I always try to just clear that right up. So the entire agenda came out of the Global South. So it emerged from, women had been working to prevent war as well as fight in war for hundreds and thousands literally of years, as I know you talked about with Margaret Macmillan last week. So women have played a whole range of roles, but in creating this women, peace, and security area of focus in particular, they came from Rwanda, from the Balkans, from Guatemala, the Philippines, so many places. And, their organization came to the UN. So was it a bunch of Western countries at the UN that brought it forward, or UN diplomats sitting in New York? No, as I mentioned, it was initiated by Bangladesh. It was tabled by Namibia. It was supported by Jamaica and by Canada. And it's also the single most translated UN Security Council resolution in the world, the single most translated. And you can't get that unless you have civil society, women-led civil society in communities everywhere who think it's useful to them. And I always try to say, so it's clear it came from the Global South, and it's actually quite offensive on many levels to imply that millions of women in non-Western countries are just pawns. They're tremendous leaders, but they're not agents of their own destiny. They've been fooled in some way. There's so many tremendous women from outside of Western countries who've advocated for this for so many years, and it's offensive to them to think that this is not of their own agency. Now, have white women become dominant in some forms of feminism? Absolutely. Is that problematic? Absolutely. But the answer is to change that, to work and ensure that there are more Black and brown and Indigenous women and women of color in shaping this going forward, not to erase the work that has been done by so many women over time. So the second part of that is that, it's simply not culturally appropriate. in some places. And I feel really, really strongly about this one because it's a very important one, and it comes from a lot of people who really want to do the right thing. And I want to be extra clear that culture matters enormously, and it has to determine our approach, how we discuss it, our messengers, our pace, the types of words that people use, the way that Canada, for example, engages. But if you believe that rights are universal, then you don't simply write off certain contexts and say women should have equal rights, but not there because it's tough. And so, you know, I've worked with women for so many years and heard so many reactions to these comments. And, you know, a few that women peace builders will raise is, you know, number one, cultures change. And, you know, in Canada alone, it was part of our culture for so many years for Indigenous kids to be forced into residential schools. In Global Affairs Canada, you could be fired for being gay. You know, we had elements that we accepted as part of our culture that are now, that fortunately are evolving and have changed. And so women will often say to me, you know, who gets to define our culture? Is it the Taliban on September 10th, 2001, who get to say, this is Afghan culture and I can't play a role in evolving it? And the last thing I'd say just about the culture point is that having worked on this for many, many years, the culture argument is most often used by people purporting to speak for other groups. And it's most often actually about power. So it's about those who are seeking to get power or to maintain it, usually through the barrel of a gun. And they have no interest in being challenged or being held accountable by their own communities. And they know that outsiders are particularly scared of this argument, so they use it. And we're so focused on not wanting to do harm, as we should be. And I think we need to recognize that every intervention has some effects. And so we have to think about, does interventions that we make that reinforce stereotypical notions of gender roles, do they do harm? Are we deepening existing power imbalances? Are we enabling or entrenching corrupt networks? Those do harm. So being sort of gender blind, so to speak, can do harm. And the problem is not, you know, we want to do no harm, but I think sometimes we take a very surface view of what does harm. And we consult only a kind of elite, predominantly male group of people within a community about what the community itself wants. And so I think we really have to, again, be extremely attentive to context, to culture, and recognize that we cannot be contributing to problems, but we have to also understand that there are women in every community who want to have the option to have a voice in decisions that affect their lives. And there are women's movements and there are women's civil society leaders. And our job is not to speak for them, it's to amplify and support what they're saying. So we always have to be in a secondary support position. But I really feel strongly we can't simply just say, well, it's not culturally appropriate for women in this place to be involved. And a lot of women peace builders that you will work with get really just enraged when they hear this kind of comment. So that's one of the things that we work about, or I work on engaging with people about.
So clearly, if this is the case, then you have probably experienced some resistance to your efforts along the way and in working on women, peace, and security. When that happens, how do you push back? How do you manage it, and how do you make strides forward, the resistance notwithstanding?
Sure. So I'd say, I want to be clear, I think the vast majority of people I work with are supportive of the goals of gender equality and want to play a positive role in advancing them and supporting women's engagement. So for the minority that are not fully on board, I think one of the interesting aspects of this work is that we're now at a stage where I think most people know more or less what they're expected to say about this issue, or what they could say that would be a red flag for most people. It's been around long enough that I think people are aware of the keywords to avoid or that are problematic, etc. So resistance has been harder to detect. You won't have a lot of people who say, I actually don't think that this is important. Or I don't think that women in this place should be allowed to be at these peace talks. They're simply, you know, they'll have other reasons. And so I think dealing with resistance in part is getting, the task is being a little more sophisticated in understanding it. So you know, for example, looking, are people saying that it's a priority but not assigning any resources to it? You know, are there budgets associated with things? Are they spending money, precious money, to advance it? Or are they relegating discussions to committees or processes that where they're likely to just die a slow death? Do they do one event a year around International Women's Day but have no internal reflection as an organization on you know, their composition, their structure, the level of voice that women within their organizations have? So we're trying to, part of the resistance is making sure that we're attentive to forms of resistance that are not completely overt. And I'd say, you know, ideally we're not, my approach generally is to try to not be in a situation where there's direct resistance. And I think part of the strategy and the important approach in all of this is coming to the conversation with a really, really deep sense of humility, and making sure that people we're engaging with are not defensive about it because they don't feel that they're being lectured. And so I always think it's so important to talk about, you know, racial and gender inequalities and other forms of discrimination at home in Canada, you know, to talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, to talk about, you know, the challenges that First Nations and Métis and Inuit women in Canada continue to pay. I mean, living at this nexus of sexism, but racism and colonialism, and to acknowledge that we have all kinds of historical sexist patriarchal policies that have created ongoing issues. So Canada still has so much work to do. Just acknowledging that always in every conversation is crucial. And then also, you know, acknowledging what other countries are doing well. So, you know, Afghanistan, for example, has members of civil society in a steering group for its national action plan, an official role. We stole that idea from them, and now we have that as well. So, you know, Jordan has a brand new national action plan that has a totally different format and was based on consultations that included with women in refugee camps within Jordan. And they talk about a whole range of issues that are different from normal national action plans. So, you know, I think recognizing and being genuine in acknowledging what other countries are doing very well also helps disarm people. And then, you know, always the best way to deal with resistance is, of course, to not be in the front line, but to have women peace builders themselves always be in the lead. So ensuring that representatives from the Global South are, you know, the frontline voice of many things, ensuring that women peace builders are speaking for themselves. I'm always suspicious of anyone who speaks for others, and ensuring that that's in the lead. And then the other last thing I'd say, and I know we can go on and on about this, but the last thing I'd say is that one of the things I talk about often is the resistance that we get is often in the form of people who think something's important but not a priority, or something that is kind of good to do but after we've done some other, you know, key things. And so something that I tend to point out is that, you know, there are groups out there and individuals out there who understand this concept of gender as it relates to security. And many of those groups are adversaries, or groups that we are engaging with in all kinds of conflict areas. And they're not using the terms gender-based analysis plus or women, peace and security, et cetera, but they're thinking about gender roles and how they are impactful. You know, for example, ISIS, 1 out of every 5 women who left North America and Europe to go fight with ISIS or join ISIS in the Middle East were women. So 20% of ISIS are women, and they had very deliberate recruitment messages to women in North America and Europe, talking about, you know, their role in building a caliphate, so all kinds of things. If you're living in North America and you wear a hijab, you'll never be fully accepted. So they had messages directed at women. Boko Haram, 2/3 of its suicide bombers are women. 2/3, well, and many of those are children, so child soldiers. And they do that very deliberately and strategically because they know that women can often go with less attention through a marketplace. There are fewer women in security forces who can do physical checks on them, et cetera. So they're exploiting these gender dynamics and they're using them to their own advantage. So part of the way of addressing resistance is in part saying, you know, they're there whether you address them or not. And the challenge, I think, is to engage and ensure women are built into their voices are heard as we're creating policies and approaches so that we don't fall into all kinds of traps and mistakes.
So how has the pursuit of women, peace, and security been impacted by COVID-19?
Oh, so many ways, like everything else. I mean, I think most frontline peace builders and people who focus on peace work that I've engaged with, many of them, their organizations, at least during the initial phases of the outbreak, really had to pivot to be frontline service providers. So many are running public awareness campaigns about healthy practices, why to wear masks, et cetera. They're also kind of fighting misinformation online and in other ways, and using their position as trusted members of the community to ensure that the pandemic is managed as effectively as possible and taken seriously. Many of them are finding themselves vulnerable in ways that they didn't before. And a key example of this, one of the very first people in Colombia to be killed after the pandemic began was a woman human rights defender in Colombia. As soon as lockdown went into effect, she was assassinated right outside of her home. And that was because her attackers knew where she would be. And so we're seeing attacks on women human rights defenders and peace builders are increasing. And part of that is in response or because of authoritarian approaches to pandemic management and the emboldening of authoritarian or strongman governments around the world who are really exploiting the pandemic to crack down on citizens or on people within their countries organizing and mobilizing and their freedom of speech, et cetera. Basma Moumani, one of your fabulous professors and scholars, did an interview a little while ago. It's now 10 years after the so-called Arab Spring. And as she pointed out, a lot of security forces learned a lot of lessons from the Arab Spring, where prior to that, they were not monitoring social media. They were not aware of online approaches for community organizing and resistance, and are much more attentive to that now. So it's very, very difficult for a lot of people to be, women included, very much to be organizing and planning and doing this, resistance work often in many cases, or raising issues to hold the state accountable. And so that's why a lot of work had to be done in person before, and taking it online presents all kinds of new risks. And so, in the short term, a lot of them are focused on prisoners, recognizing really horrific condition within prisons and calling for release of human rights defenders, political prisoners. That's a big priority for Syrian women, for women in Afghanistan, where the majority of women are incarcerated for nonviolent crimes, and at least half of women in prisons have been charged with so-called moral crimes. So like sex outside of marriage or failing virginity tests. Now they're facing, dramatically increased risks because of COVID. A lot are echoing calls from the Secretary General for a ceasefire. Many are very concerned about vaccine distribution and the potential ways that could exacerbate inequalities. And many are concerned, all are concerned, I think, and many are working actively on the potential kind of secondary and tertiary effects of the pandemic. So, for example, we know that 9 out of 10 kids in the world are out of school right now. Well, girls are less likely to go back than boys. What are some of the long-term implications of that? We're seeing increased recruitment of boys and girls into extremist groups. We're seeing more violence in the home. We're seeing many women, and this is happening in Canada and everywhere else, who are less capable of participating in the workforce due to caregiving responsibility. So many have to remove themselves, or are getting removed from the workforce because of caregiving responsibilities. This is happening everywhere. So what's the long-term effect of that? Massive increases in early and forced marriages, because families have to effectively sell their children in order to be able to support themselves and provide food for themselves, et cetera. So they're, the full range, and sorry to go on in that diverse way, just to say that, it's affecting people in so many different ways, and many of the effects are going to be very, very long term. Of course, we're also trying to find ways to have this moment be transformational and have some positive impacts, and we can talk about that maybe in the Q&A separately. But there's a lot of crisis still very much deep crisis experience for women peace builders and women civil society or women-led civil society organizations.
Thank you. Before we turn to questions, I'd like to ask you one more question on, bearing in mind that we have many young scholars and young professionals tuning in today. What would be some top tips that you would leave them with, over and above the fact that we care deeply about these issues? They are reflected and embedded in our curriculum, but what else can we do? What else can they do specifically?
I love this question because there's always some variation of it, and I have so many thoughts on it. So for something I often say for both teachers and students is start by doing just a little audit of your courses, your curricula. So look at your curricula, look at your reading lists. How many female authors do you have? How many non-gender conforming authors do you have? How many racialized people do you have as authors? How many authors from the global South? You know, are you getting a range of inputs? And it's hard. Often it's getting easier all the time. But you know, a lot of the so-called kind of foundational texts are quite frankly written by white men. And in courses where you want to give people the basis of things that are often, you know, sometimes people do this and they find like 95% of a curricula is written by a white man. Nothing wrong, you know, with that perspective, but is it diverse enough? Are you getting a broad set of voices? And to do the same with the media that you're consuming. So when you're reading an article, you know, just start by noticing, are women being quoted? Are women from the area that is being, the conflict area in particular that is being discussed, are they being quoted? You know, look at your social media feeds. Are you following Indigenous women? Is it just one, or do you have, you know, diverse voices of Indigenous women that you're getting input from consistently? So I think that's the kind of basis, the starting point is just like really do an audit of what you're consuming and the inputs that you're getting, so that you're aware of it in the first place. And then moving up the ladder of engagement, I think you can, there are a number of organizations, or even just if you want to start with joining some different listservs. So getting on email distribution lists. I think there's probably, younger people don't probably want email distribution lists. They'll be in some kind of social media group that I don't even understand or know about, but start getting information from groups like the Women, Peace and Security Network of Canada or various other organizations that care about this, and start getting information. You'll hear about opportunities, more events you can participate in, etc. Always money matters, so supporting women-led organizations financially in Canada and around the world. And you know, it's kind of cliche, but it always is important, is let your politicians know what matters to you, to your members of provincial assemblies, to members of parliament, to say, we care that Canada does something about this, or we want more on this, anything that you want. Politicians do need to hear from people, and sometimes they hear about them only when something is problematic, not when something is going well. The last thing I promise that I'd say on this, and this is something that I wish I had thought about or knew more, or done more deliberately from the time that I was a student, but that's to focus a little bit more on the skills of being an advocate or a champion for change, not just gathering the knowledge that you need to do that. So what I mean by that is, for example, a number of people, very helpfully, have told me that I'm a terrible storyteller, as you've seen. I come from a long line of very terrible storytellers, and it's something that I really need to work on to be able to engage people in a different way. I kind of tend to think in bullet points and you know, organize things according to logical blocks, and that's not always how you convince people and compel them. So what else do I need in my own toolkit? One of them is being able to be a better storyteller. You know, check are you good at running a meeting? Are you good at fundraising? Like, have you had practice asking someone for money for a cause? Can you write a proposal? Those are all kinds of ways that you can build the skills that you need to be an advocate or a champion that can get you different forms of traction as opposed to just having the knowledge. And I think I've focused always, and many people focus a lot on getting the knowledge, which matters, but you also need to be able to navigate too. So I'd say focus on some of the skills as much as what you learn in a book or online. So I'll end there. Sorry to go on so long about that.
No, I mean, irrespective of what you've just said about your storytelling skills, I think you've told us a wonderful story today. It's been insightful, it's been illuminating. I would like to turn to the audience, if, with your permission, and take some of the questions that are coming in through different feeds. One that has been posted on the board is to thank you for your presentation and your views on whether or not you think your mandate will be expanded beyond 3 years.
I mean, it was 3 years in part based on the duration of our national action plan. So the end of it is in the end of 2021, which coincides with the timing of our national action plan. I hope very much that we'll have a robust third national action plan. In an ideal world, we wouldn't need a champion, and maybe we'll get to that point soon. Maybe we won't, we'll see, but hopefully whether it's me or someone else, I hope that the focus on women, peace, and security continues. And I always emphasize that thus far it has been a largely nonpartisan issue in Canada. So we had our first plan under a Conservative government, the second one under a Liberal government. We have parliamentarians from all parties who have supported key elements of this. So I think it's really crucial, and I constantly emphasize the need to ensure that it's not viewed as a political something, but an issue that people from all parties agree on is important for Canada and Canada's role in the world. So I look forward to continued support from all fronts on this, and we'll see about the mandate for this role itself.
Super, thank you. Another question about an issue that you've already touched upon, but could you expand your views further and share with us what writings, articles, books, thinkers have shaped your understanding of women in peace and security activities, and more generally gender in foreign policy and security?
Sure. Okay, where do I even start on this one? Just thinking, there's a couple that if I have to write them down or they'll fly right out of my mind. Okay, one of the best books that I've read on this is called Sex and World Peace, and it's by a woman, Dr. Valerie Hudson. And she's also got a new set of research that's just come out, and it's what I find fascinating about her is that she talks about relationships. Basically, one of her key takeaways is that the single best predictor of whether a country will go to war with itself, a civil war, or with its neighbors is not its GDP, it's not where it's based in the world, its neighborhood, it's not its ethno-religious affiliation, etc., composition. It's how women are treated, and are women able to exercise their rights. So she really takes it to a level of what do we know, what can we learn about the way that women around the world are able to exercise their rights. So that's one. I think Sex and World Peace, I highly recommend it. A couple other authors, there's a woman named Jamie Hagan who's written about, she calls it queering the women, peace, and security agenda. And she really has helped me and many others understand the challenges of using gender binaries in our work, the way that women, peace, and security as a agenda had not been informed sufficiently by lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people, and about how we can be more inclusive as a movement. And I think that's been just crucial. And then to try to take my own advice, something that I've done over the last several years is try to follow on Twitter and on various other spaces as many women of color, as many Black, Indigenous, and other women of color that I can, in terms of scholars who are writing about, you know, women, peace, and security in this field of scholarship. There's a woman named Bonnie Jenkins. She's created an organization called Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security. And they've produced a number of recommendations papers. They had, you know, a series of great papers around the Black Lives Matter movement and demonstrations over the summer in particular in the US. And it's just been so grounding and so important to me to constantly remember the gaps that I have, the blind spots that I have, the ways that my systems that I work in have systemic discrimination, and really try to understand how I can dismantle to the best I can some of those systems that I work within, and sometimes I know unknowingly perpetuate.
Question on nuclear disarmament. The person asking the question suggests that this would seem to be a natural goal for a feminist foreign policy, and would ask how you would see Canada contributing to making progress in this area.
Yeah, I mean, you know, so much of the women's movement as it relates to peace and security was founded around disarmament. So the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom, WILP, was founded around a call for disarmament. And there have been so many movements related to it, and such a grounding in disarmament that relates to feminist movements in particular. And so I certainly agree that it is a natural place where a feminist foreign policy can focus and can be implemented. And so as many of you know, the government announced a consultation that started last year, and very soon we'll be coming out with a paper that articulates the elements of feminist foreign policy. And in a lot of the consultation that civil society led, that we led through our embassies and missions around the world, disarmament is certainly a part of it, and nuclear disarmament as well. So I know that there are many people who have not agreed with some of the positions that various Canadian governments over time have taken, and I think it's worthy of reflection. And as always, I encourage people to contact their members of parliament with very specific perspectives on that, because that's something that they do constantly need and want to hear from Canadians on.
Thank you very much. Question here on the intersection of the Women, Peace and Security agenda and arms trade. So is Canada's feminist foreign policy compatible with Canada's role in the arms trade, for example, to countries like Saudi Arabia? And what can we do about the latter?
So, you know, I certainly understand a lot of the concerns that people have about the arms sales that we have to a range of countries. In the broader sense, to not speak specifically to that case, but in the broader sense, one of the things that is a focus internally is to improve the process for getting arms exports permits, or arms permits to be able to sell arms to different countries. And so there's always a process internally to try to strengthen that. And, you know, it's always got room for improvement. So we've certainly been strengthening the extent to which, for example, gender-based violence is incorporated into our analysis of whether a country should be eligible to receive weapons sales. But there's always a room to go. So that's part of the area that we're trying to improve, and again, part of where members of parliament need to continue to hear from Canadians.
Thank you. There's a question about the root governance and social systems and cultures that actually impact institutional responses to this agenda, and in some cases pose barriers to policy response. And the person asking the question takes us to the area of peace operations and says that we're now seeing, by way of the UN resolution, work to create departments and ministries of peace in member states, countries. And this is dear to my heart because Ethiopia, a country that I work a lot in, and the Sudan, as you know, Ambassador, has created a ministry of peace, which now overarches the hardcore security sector. And the question is really asking, should Canada be thinking along the same lines, creating these new institutional structures that will change culture and social systems and physical systems as well?
Yeah. I'm a big fan of that, whether it's the department itself, creation of a new department itself, or just the focusing of resources on the work needed to build peace. And I really think that in the world generally, we have not the right balance of resources dedicated to fighting wars as we do to building peace. And we need more on prevention, more on all kinds of aspects that go, as you mentioned, into a ministry of peace. And some, this is an area of hope that I dare have related to the pandemic, which is that, as part of both the pandemic and, again, the Black Lives Matter movement on a focus on racial discrimination and systematic bias and injustice that we have, I think a lot of people are redefining the way that they think about what makes us secure. So the pandemic struck, all the weapons and tanks in the world were powerless at addressing what was making each person, almost each person on the planet, feel insecure, at least to some level. And we saw all kinds of things that really we need to learn. So we saw the importance of local organizations responding, of having, access and trust of local communities, of not relying on massive machineries, either defense-related ones or even, multilateral or national organizations, but the value of local organizations, understanding needs and being responsive and knowing where people's fears were, what they can build upon, et cetera. And so it's a roundabout way of saying that I think we're having a range of conceptual shifts, consciously or not, that, their security is an issue that is domestic, that we have to attend to every day, that, nuclear deterrence and our nuclear stockpile means so little to me if I walk out and, my son is beaten by police, if I can't get a vaccine. There's a whole range of different calculations that we have, I think, to making us aware of what makes us secure or not, and that we have to keep working at this. And so I think any effort to keep a focus on investing in peace and not just focusing on responses or on kind of defensive strategies is really important.
Okay, I want to focus on that for the next two questions that I'll leave you with. One is the root of the question that I just read to you a moment ago, actually, and the person was keen to know how Canada could be a co-sponsor of this kind of advancement overseas. Now, there was another question about Canada's advancement overseas too, and how we could use our feminist foreign policy to reassess and perhaps reduce our commitments to NATO, which seem to have become an arms trading organization, ramping up a new Cold War, etc., with exercises on borders of Russia, and opposing the nuclear weapons ban treaty. So how do we take this agenda overseas into to impact on current commitments?
I mean, I think in terms of how Canada can support this internationally, this is ultimately always going to be a domestic priority, right? So countries are going to have to determine for themselves if they want a ministry of peace or the level of resources that they want to put into it. One of the best things we can do is model it ourselves. So continue to and increase always investments in what we just talked about. I know there are a lot of people who hold the opinion about a negative opinion about Canada's membership in NATO. I don't share that in its entirety. I think we are working within NATO to change a lot of important things, and that there are a lot of benefits to being part of NATO. But the key thing to me that we are is that we consistently bring feminist perspectives and bring a lens of women, peace, and security. And those are not exactly the same things, but to the work that we're doing, and not just not leave it only as, well, therefore we need more women in military forces, or we need more women in NATO leadership positions. We need to look at the entirety of the systems that all of them are engaged in, and think about, are they contributing to power imbalances? Are they supporting the prevention of conflict, the peaceful resolution of it, et cetera? And so I think that's what Canada can and should continue to do.
Great. I'm going to take one more question, if I may, before closing the session. And the question is, the world is now experiencing a global crisis. We know from past crises, like world wars, that things like the UN human rights were resulted as states learned how to move forward together. Does COVID-19 aid and assist feminist peace building and the role of women? Or does the crisis actually give more power to masculine forms of statecraft that we are trying to surpass?
The answer is up to us, I think. I mean, to me, this is the big question of the moment. And I always say in my office, you know, I try, and generally I try to never use the term lessons learned, because I don't always think that our institutions learn them. And we're seeing a lot of things right now that we have to make sure that we reflect in the way that we operate. So, you know, one of the things would be the idea that local knowledge is so important, and then the local capacity of organizations is crucial. So we have to keep supporting them. I think there are a whole other range of ways that we can, if we are thoughtful and strategic, adapt. But super basic one is the collection of gender disaggregated data. I mean, it's still amazing to me that we have so little information about the ways that different genders are affected by issues, let alone, you know, when you add in racial diversity, economic diversity, you know, rural, urban, et cetera. And some colleagues and I kind of joke sometimes that this got a lot of attention at the start of the pandemic, when there were people saying, you know, men are more likely to die from COVID than women. So people were saying, well, we need gender disaggregated data. In part, that was because at the time in China, it turned out, in part, you know, men were more likely to be smokers than women. So then that didn't bear out internationally, et cetera. But we need much more data on the way that men, women, people, non-gender conforming people are affected, all sorts of other things. That's one. Also attention to gender-based violence and domestic violence. We're just so, you know, this is a crisis, and we have to build that into the way that we think about governance and about funding, et cetera. So I know we're short on time, and I'll leave it there, but I have to emphasize what we do with what we've seen and learned is up to us, and we have to keep focusing on strengthening and learning from what we're seeing right now.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I would like to now call upon a big leading voice of ours at the Balsillie School in the field of women, peace and security, and a real advocate for the cause, Tamara Lawrence, one of our PhD in global governance students, to close the session.
So on behalf of the Balsillie School for International Affairs, I would like to thank Ambassador O'Neill for speaking to us today and sharing her thoughts on how we might advance the Women, Peace and Security agenda. We held this event to mark the 20th anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action for Women. And as you heard from Ambassador O'Neill in her remarks today, the Women, Peace and Security agenda is an important, intersectional, and potentially transformative initiative that ensures women have a voice and a role to play to prevent the threat of violence, armed conflict, and war. Ambassador O'Neill needs us to partner with her on this agenda to move it forward. And as she said, the government and our elected officials also need to hear from us. So I would like to let everyone on the webinar know that Ambassador O'Neill regularly briefs and closely works with the Women, Peace and Security Network Canada. I'm also a member of this network, and it is a network of academics, practitioners, activists, and representatives from civil society organizations from across the country who are working on peace building, peacemaking, disarmament, development, mediation, and conflict resolution at home and abroad. The network also works closely with Global Affairs, and this spring we are expecting Minister Garneau to release Canada's first feminist foreign policy. The network just released an excellent document entitled Be Brave, Be Bold, Our Recommendations for Canada's Feminist Foreign Policy, and I urge you to check it out. The Women, Peace and Security Network Canada welcomes your participation. You can find out more on our website if you Google it. I would also like to encourage you to follow on Twitter the ambassador. Her Twitter handle is at Jackie O'Neill. Also to follow the Women, Peace and Security Network on Twitter, as well as the Balsillie School of International Affairs, so you can find out about our upcoming events. And finally, we would like to wish you all a wonderful family day, long weekend, and a happy Valentine's Day. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tamara. Ambassador, thank you once again for kicking off this very important reading week, family weekend, and incredibly important women, peace, and security agenda for the country, for the world. We wish you luck. Please stay in touch with the Balsillie School moving forward. Thank you.
Mara. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you.